That's all right. Hey, go ahead and grab your Bibles and open up to Ephesians chapter 6. If you don't have a Bible that you feel like you can read and understand, there's a paperback one at the end of the row. Grab one of those suckers, pass it down your row. If you're hanging out with us online at mochurch.tv, welcome. Open up another tab in your browser. We'll be using the NIV version here in-house this morning today. So we're closing out our Pac-Man Fever series today, and we are talking about the video game Fortnite. Fortnite is a video game that's only been around for a couple of years. It was developed, designed, and released by Epic Games in late 2017. And it's available for play across basically every modern console that's available right now, including Windows, PC, computers, Mac computers, PS4, Xbox One, even recently the Nintendo Switch, and most recently they have released the version for the for play on your Apple or Android phones. I could not possibly imagine trying to play this epic game, epic because it's so big, epic game on your tiny phone, but it's become pretty popular. And there's some really fun aspects to this game. We're going to have to jump in because what the game exactly is, because I am not a gamer and I had a lot to learn about the game of Fortnite, and there's a lot of fun things that come into this video game. For example, there's a llama. Yeah, there's a llama. And I was led to believe for basically an entire month that you can actually ride the llama in the game, and it wasn't until the end of service, our last service last week at our Twinsburg, Macedonia campus, that someone finally came up to me and told me, you can't ride the llama. The llama's a piñata. You're supposed to beat the llama, break it open, because once you break open the llama, there's all kinds of like fun things inside, like a normal piñata. There's not many llamas in the game, so I never came across one. But if I did, I was going to try and ride it. But you don't ride the llama. You don't ride the llama. There's secret fun things inside. Other fun things about the game, this is probably what I heard most about the game, was this thing called emoting. And emoting is what we saw in the first part of that video. Emoting is just dancing. I don't know why they call it emoting when you could call it dancing, but it's called emoting. And basically what you do is you just pick a dance that you want to do. There's all kinds of different dances. You can see the Carlton, the Fresh, the Orange Justice. Yeah. Ooh. I don't know what I'm doing. That's evident, Curtis. That is evidence. You got Disco Fever. There's all kinds of fun dancing that you can do, emoting in the game. And it's basically a way of trash talking your opponents. Now, there's 3 different styles of gameplay in the game. First is Save the World, where you work together as a team to try and save the world from an end-of-world apocalypse. There's Creative Mode, where you can actually go in and build your own world and then invite friends to come battle inside that. And then the most popular version of the video game mode of playing is what's called the Battle Royale. Battle Royale is where 100 players at a time battle it out against each other in order to be the last person or last team standing. Now, all the playing modes have been successful, like in their own right, but the game that skyrocketed Fortnite to such great success and has actually become kind of a cultural phenomenon is the battle mode, the Battle Royale version of the video game. In less than a year from its release, the Battle Royale version drew in more than 125 million players and began earning more than $200 million a month, meaning that in 2018, it earned well over $3 billion in revenue. That's insane. And that's the version of the video game that we're talking about this morning. And the Battle Royale version of the video game has kind of become a cultural phenomenon because teens and early adults, 20-somethings, have begun actually using the game as a form of social media, where they'll actually get online and they will hang out with each other while playing in this video game. There was an article that was released the same week that I was preparing this message, and this is what the article had to say about the video game. It says, Fortnite Battle Royale is, first and foremost, a last-man-standing shooter-style game, especially popular among teens and 20-somethings. In the game, 100 players at a time jump out of a flying bus and onto an island. Combatants are left to duke it out, Hunger Games style, with a variety of weapons, armor, healables, and other tools at their disposal. Though the premise is violent, the game itself really isn't, with none of the gore or blood of more graphic offerings. Eventually, the final combatant claims the coveted victory royale. All told, each match lasts around 20 minutes. That's what this article had to say about this game. Let me break that down for you, exactly how the game goes. You pick your character. You get to pick what character you want. There's nothing really fancy about that. You just choose what character you want and who you want to look like. And then you get entered into an arena, and the game begins with you're on this flying bus. I don't know why. You're on a bus. I also really love the fact that they chose a bus that's been booted by the police. It's just like, we don't want this bus going anywhere, so we're attaching a hot air balloon to it, and we're going to let people jump out of it. So you're inside this bus, and when you're in this bus, you are floating over an island, this huge map. Now, this map is absolutely ginormous. There's 100 other players that start on here, and it's not uncommon for you to start and not really see anybody else. This map is huge. When the bus gets over what part of the map you want it to be, you jump out of the bus, and you free fall towards the ground. And as you're free falling, eventually when you get closer to the point where you want to, you deploy some form of like cartoony parachute. In this case, it's this little umbrella. Sometimes it's like a paper airplane. Some people have these weird like cobra snakes. I don't know. There's a lot that I don't understand, but a lot of fun things kind of about the game. And then you safely land on the ground. When you land on the ground, you are armed with only a pickaxe, which you have to use to loot and find things throughout the map like new weapons, shields, vehicles to help you eliminate the other 99 players that are on the map. When I first decided to do Fortnite as our last game in the Pac-Man Fever series, I recognized I was actually going to have to go play the game if I wanted to preach a good message on it, which meant that I had to find somebody who played the game. So I found a buddy of mine who has a son in high school, asked if I could come over and play the game Fortnite, went over to his house, sat down, and I was like, I need you to help me play Fortnite. So he said, okay. So we set it up. I chose the character that I wanted to be, and then I was entering into the map, and he told me, I'm going to have you play 1v1. I don't know what that means. And I've already like put myself out there. Hey, I need your help for me to play this video game. So I've already put myself out there that I don't know anything about this video game. So it should have been very easy for me to say, hey, what's 1v1? But I've got way too much pride for that. And so I just pretended like I knew what he was talking about. And I assumed that meant I was going to play one player versus one player, and it would probably be the person I was sitting next to, because that's how I played video games growing up. So he gets me started, the game begins, and I recognize he doesn't have a controller. So I said, hey, where's your controller? And he said, oh, I'm not playing. And I said, who is? He said, the other 99 people that are going to be on the internet. And I said, did you at least put this on like beginner or like noob mode or something? He said, oh, they don't have that. So I said, oh. He said, but I'll walk you through it. So we begin. I jump out of the bus, and I land on the ground. And he goes, oh, look, a vehicle. Go get the vehicle. So I just start running. And he goes, wait, where are you going? It must have been pretty evident I didn't know what he was talking about. So I just started running, because I heard run. You just run, right? That's what you do. Someone says run, you run. You don't ask why. You just run. So he says, you go get the vehicle, run. So I take off running. Where are you going? And I just look around. He points me in the direction of the vehicle. I run over to the vehicle, and he says, quick, press the button to get on the vehicle. It was a four-wheeler type thing. So I press the button that I think is going to get me on the vehicle, and instead, my character starts flossing like this. He goes, what are you doing? What are you doing? No. And then all of a sudden, I hear bang, and I'm dropped down on all fours, and my character is crawling. There's nothing else that I can do. And the camera switches so that it's looking behind me, and I see another character from way far away come running up on the map. And the other character, the other player, runs all the way up to me, stands over my body, flosses, and then waves at the camera at me, takes his pickaxe, hits me, and I'm eliminated from the video game. A match that lasts about 20 minutes, I lasted all about 30 seconds. And that was my first time playing Fortnite. I am a horrible video game player. And it did not get much better the next several times that I played. But ladies and gentlemen, I am here to celebrate with you this morning that eventually I did finish number 46 Yeah, give it up, orange, just, ooh. Top 50%, what, you know? So here's the deal. Fortnite is a video game shooter style, last man standing type thing. And when I finished, when I got wiped out, my buddy wisely said, seems like we should focus on getting you armor instead of a vehicle. And I said, sounds like a good idea. Bottom line, in Fortnite with me, when it was my first time playing, armor helps you win the battle. That was kind of the bottom line. That was something that I needed to learn. It did not go much better the next several times I played, but I did begin to get better and last longer in the video game. Now, if I'm totally honest with you, I saw and heard more about the emoting in the video game before I actually played the video game than I ever did about the actual gameplay. As I was going around and I heard students talking and stuff like, I saw more students doing the dancing or overhearing them hanging out during the gameplay more than I did ever about them actually playing in the battle. And so when I jumped into the video game, I thought this was more of like a dancing style video game. It's not. The whole point of the video game is a battle. But there wasn't much of the talk that was going on around that. And then once I actually got into the battle and I realized more of what was going on, it was so complicated to understand, and I felt so overwhelmed with trying to understand where I was on the map and what it was I was supposed to be doing and how to control my player, that it was really difficult for me to pay any attention to the battle that was going on around me. And so today we're going to talk about something in this Pac-Man Fever series that I'm going to be straight up with you from the beginning. What we're talking about this morning is going to feel a little odd. But I think if we really take the time and we're honest with ourselves, it's not going to be very difficult for us to see how true this is in our own lives. And so what I really want to encourage you to do, we're eventually going to get to Ephesians 6, but I got to kind of set the stage. And so I can't encourage you enough. Start a note section on your phone, pull out your program, maybe write some notes down in your Bible, write these other Bible verses that we're going to talk about, and then go home this week and read through them and think about what it is and how this maybe is true in your own life. You see, because I think the gameplay of this game, Fortnite, at least how I felt the very first time I sat down and got to play this game, I think this game is a great metaphor for following Jesus. Especially someone who decides to begin following Jesus, someone who begins to understand who Jesus is and live out Jesus' teachings in their own life. I think this game and my experience with the first time playing it is a great metaphor for following Jesus. You see, a lot of us, when we kind of are on the outskirts before we really jump back into church, we hear a lot of good things about Jesus. We hear the forgiveness that he offers. We hear the hope that he offers. This idea of starting over fresh and new is great, a life of peace and hope and joy. And so we decide, much like I did, yeah, let's give this game a shot. There's like fun things like flossing and stuff like that. Let's give it a shot. Let's see what this video game's all about. But we don't realize that really what we're jumping into is a battle. We hear a ton about the good things that Jesus offers, hope and joy and peace, and those are all true and those are all good, but we don't hear or seem to spend much time talking or thinking about the difficult things, the reality that there is a spiritual battle that's going on around us. And so I just want to check out just a couple of the things that the Bible has to say about what's going on around us and who is fighting against us. A guy named Peter, who was a close follower, close friend of Jesus, he writes a letter, and in it he says this, in 1 Peter 5:8, he says this, be alert, pay attention, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Now, I don't know how many National Geographic documentaries that you have watched, but when a lion sneaks up on its prey, it's pretty scary. Because there's usually like 3 different cameras, right? There's usually a camera where you can see both the lion and the prey, a camera that's solely on the lion, and a camera that's solely on the prey. And to the prey, there's nothing wrong that's going on. But you're watching, you're like, dude, look out. It's coming, right? And the prey doesn't seem like there's anything wrong. Maybe they have kind of a feeling, something feels a little off, and they'll pick their head up and they'll look around a little bit more. And they have a feeling that something's off, but they never really know until it's too late, and the lion has jumped on them, has pounced on them, has captured, and is beginning to devour them. And Peter says, man, you've got to pay attention. And this sober mind thing is so, like, you've got to be clear. You've got to be clear-headed and understand what is going on around you. Satan is looking out. He is watching you, and he is just waiting for his moment. He's just waiting for his moment to jump all over you. And so Peter goes on, and he says this in 1 Peter 5:9. He says, resist him. Resist him, standing firm. It's like this fighting stance sort of deal. And this is going to be a common theme that we see in our verses that we read today. He says, resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. So he says, first, resist him, fight back. This is a battle. This is a fight. Stand firm. Be ready. Be on guard. And he also says, notice that this is going on kind of throughout the whole world. This isn't just a you thing. This is a Satan coming after everybody sort of deal. Like, this is going on throughout the entire world. He's saying this should be expected. And when you decide to follow Jesus, when you decide to get serious about following Jesus, you have got to recognize Satan's coming after you. Now, this isn't just something that Peter just decided to make up someday to explain why he was having a bad day. This is actually something that Peter got from Jesus. So it may feel weird to kind of talk about the devil like this, and I get it, but this isn't just something Peter made up, and this is something that he gets from Jesus. And so I want to look at one story. There were many places where Jesus talked about the devil, talked about Satan like this, but there's one place where I feel like he gives the best possible description, the most vivid description of our enemy. And one time Jesus is teaching, and in this teaching we're going to go over to John chapter 8. John chapter 8 is a very popular chapter in the Bible, lots of good sayings from Jesus, and Jesus is actually in a discussion with some other religious leaders, some other religious scholars, and they're going back and forth about who actually has authority to be teaching and doing the things that Jesus is doing. And there's popular verses that people love to quote from John chapter 8, one of which is John 8:32, where Jesus says, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free, right? Okay, so lots of us know this verse. People love to quote this verse. Politicians love to quote this verse. I don't know that they know it's from the Bible. I don't know that they know that Jesus was the one who said it, but we love this verse. We love that idea. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But if you just fast forward, if you go about 12 more verses down in this conversation, Jesus says something that is so descriptive and so powerful about Satan. All right, so he's in this back and forth about who has authority with these like religious scholars. They're going back and forth, kind of building their arguments and their cases. And Jesus doesn't hold any punches back. He says this in John 8:38. He says, Jesus says to them, the religious scholars, I am telling you what I have seen in the Father's presence, and you are doing what you have heard from your father. Okay? Now notice something about this. This is a conversation, okay? So they don't, the religious scholars that Jesus is talking to, they don't see this, but we get a little extra insight early because we're reading this. When Jesus says this, notice that there's a capital F when he refers to the person who is his father. That's because he's referring to God. He says, I'm doing what I have seen from God. I've been in God's presence, and I'm doing what God has asked me to do, and you are doing what you have heard from your father. And it's a lowercase f. And the point is in this conversation, Jesus is building the case that his father, who he is getting his authority from, is someone different than who they are getting their authority from. And this is how they would do these kind of like arguments, like religious, like back in the day. And so they go back and forth about this, and Jesus, a couple verses later, makes it abundantly clear, makes it crystal clear to them, my father is God, Jesus' father is God, and your father is someone else. And so the religious scholars kind of retort back, and they say, whoa, hey, wait a minute, Jesus, what you're saying is pretty offensive right now. The only father that we have is God himself. Now look what Jesus says here, and I want you to pay more attention about what he says about Satan than who Jesus is talking to. We can forget the argument that they're having, but look what Jesus teaches and look what Jesus believes about Satan. He says this, John 8, verse 44. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. Now listen to this description. He, Satan, the devil, was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language. For he is a liar and the father of lies. We're going to leave this up here for just a second. Here's my take on what Jesus is saying. Because first off, he was a murderer. Satan was a murderer from the beginning. Now, what Jesus is referencing there is the very first story that we have in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, where Satan shows up and he lies to Adam and Eve for the purpose of stealing life from them. And what do you call someone who takes life? A murderer. It says he was a murderer from the beginning. And then look what he goes on to say. There is no truth in him. Zilch. Zero. He is all deception. When he lies, he speaks his native language. I don't even know that I can really grasp how deep and how evil that is. When someone just speaks and they just naturally flow with lies, and Jesus is saying that's his native language. That's what he understands best. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and he is the father. He is the birth person of lies. So here's what Jesus believed. And you don't have to believe this. You don't have to believe this. I get what we're talking. This is kind of weird. It's weird to talk about Satan this way. You don't have to believe this. But Jesus believed this. Jesus believed that there was actually a personality, a he, an entity, an individual, the devil. And Jesus believed that he, the devil's ultimate agenda is murder. His ultimate agenda is the destruction of human life, and the tool that he uses to destroy human life is deception. It's lies. He uses deception to deceive people that results in the destroying and the destruction of human life and all that is valuable to the human race. Think about the lies that you know that have destroyed relationships. Think about the lies that have destroyed marriages, the lies that have destroyed father and child, mother and child relationships, friends, siblings, neighbors, co-workers. All that is sacred to the human race, that Satan is against all of that, and his agenda is simply to destroy it, and he does that through one tool, deception, through lies. Lies to create fear and pit us against each other. Lies to create anxiety and worry and doubt within ourselves, so that in some cases we become our own worst enemy. But the bottom line, Satan wants you to doubt your beliefs and to believe your doubts. That's what he wants to get you at. He wants to get you to the point where you doubt your beliefs and you begin to believe your doubt. Now, what Jesus says here in John 8, verse 44, it's pretty unsettling, right? I think that's probably the best way to say it. That's kind of unsettling what Jesus has to say, and it's difficult to understand because of our culture. And I think because of that, it becomes really easy for us to just write that off as cheesy or maybe not real. But just because something is difficult to understand does not mean that it's not true, right? Just because something's difficult to understand also doesn't mean that you can't make use of it. I'll give you a great example of things that we don't understand that we use all the time. Ready? The cloud. I don't know how the cloud works. I don't know. Take a picture on my phone, and then all of a sudden it's on my computer. I didn't do it. Like, my picture's got to be somewhere, right? This microphone. I use this piece of plastic on my face every single week. I don't understand how it works. Someone else smarter than me could tell me, and I could probably give you a description, but I still wouldn't be able to I don't understand how or why it works. right? There are things that we don't understand that we can still know are true and we can still apply them in our lives. And I'm telling you this because we love to accept and apply the good things that Jesus has to teach and say. But a lot of times we hold up when it's like, whoa, Jesus, wait a minute. That's a little tough. And here's what I want to suggest. If we love and if we're willing to accept the good and nice things that Jesus teaches, we ought to, at the very least, pause and ponder the things that are difficult for us to agree with or for us to understand. How fickle of us is it to accept the nice and feel-good type of things that Jesus says and just dismiss the difficult because it's tough? So Jesus believes that there is an enemy that is out and coming after us. And according to Jesus, there is a battle going on, a battle by a deceiver trying to do anything to take us out. Now, in Fortnite, as soon as you land in the game, the very first thing that you need to start doing is finding weapons and supplies, and in my case, armor, in order to help you fight and win in the battle. And because of how many problems I had at the beginning, my focus was to go and find armor. Now, a leader in the early church who understood how Jesus saw this and understood Jesus' teachings because he experienced it in life, wrote a letter to a church that kind of addressed this very thing. And at the very end of the letter, he gives a metaphor for what we are supposed to do and how we can stand up against this enemy who's trying to go all out and deceive us and realize and help us realize that there is a battle that's going on around us. A guy named Paul writes this at the end of this letter called Ephesians. He says, finally, okay, now that we've understood and you're beginning to understand there's a battle going on, let me help you understand what you're supposed to do about it. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. And then he goes on and he says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Now, verse 12 would be a really weird verse if we did not have the context of how Jesus saw what's going on around us. And it appears when Paul writes here that there's actually like 4 different things that we're standing up against. But what Paul is, he's making use of this literary device called apposition, where he says something more that wants to really emphasize the seriousness of what he's talking about. And so Paul is stating that we are fighting against a spiritual enemy, that there are forces that we cannot see that are actively trying to trip us up in following Jesus. And then Paul actually gives us the antidote for this before he points out the problem. We go back and let's look at verse 11. So Paul tells us, because there's this evil that you're fighting against, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's what? Right. So you can take your stand against the devil's accident. So you can take your stand against the devil's, like if he decides to bother with you. You see, I don't know that there's a word that has a better connotation of plans that contain evil than the word scheme. Paul says you got to put on the full armor of God so that you're able to stand up against the devil's scheme. Right? The idea is that he's watching and he is waiting and he knows your weaknesses. And so when he comes after you, it's not an accident, it's a plan. It's not an accident. Man, he knows because he's been watching and he's been scheming and he's just been waiting. And so Paul says you got to put on the armor. Satan's not saying, oh, let's see if going after their marriage will trip them up. He's saying, watch this. He's not saying, hey, let's see what happens if I trip them up at work a little bit. No, he's saying, watch this. I know what'll get him. I know what'll get her. And so Paul tells us to put on the full armor of God. Now what we find out as you read this whole letter, as you read this whole book in your Bibles, you find out that Paul's actually writing this letter, most likely writing this letter while in prison. It's very likely that he's actually chained to a Roman guard. And so as he's penning out this letter, it's very possible he's able just to kind of look over his shoulder and look at the Roman soldier and use what he's wearing as a metaphor of how to stand up and fight in this battle. And so Paul plays out the metaphor, and he says this, Ephesians 6, verses 13 through 17. He says, therefore, put on the full armor of God. He says it again, therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, not if the day of evil comes, when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. Now watch how many times he says this, so that you may be able to stand your ground. And after you have what? After you've done everything to stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. And last thing, take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Now let's break this down, the metaphor that he uses to give us the armor of God. The very first thing he says is put on the belt of truth. Now the belt would be the first thing that a soldier would put on before going out to battle. It holds their underclothes, it holds their clothes tight to their body so they can move quickly, so they can floss better, you know. And there's all kinds of things, like the truth metaphor here. People think all kinds of different things. Like, what's the truth? What's the belt of truth? Is it the story of Jesus? Is it the Bible? What is it? Here is where I think it is most important for us to remember what Jesus believed about Satan, that he is a father of lies. So it is no wonder that the first thing we have to put on is the belt of truth. And I think it's the truth about who God is. That God is a God that loves you so much that he sent his son Jesus to die on the cross to take away our sins so that we could be forgiven. I think the truth is that you are worth it. That God saw you and wanted you on his team. And that through Jesus you can be forgiven. The truth is that there's a spiritual battle going on and that we need to look to Jesus for help in standing up against that. The truth is that by placing faith in Jesus and living out Jesus' teachings, you've already won. 1 John 4:4 says this, you, dear children, are from God and have overcome them, because the one who is in you, Jesus, is greater than the one who is in the world. And then 2 Thessalonians 3:3 says, but the Lord is faithful, and he will strengthen you, and he will protect you from the evil one. The truth is, you were created by a loving God that desperately wants you to live a life he created you for, and Satan will do absolutely anything to deceive you and steal that life from you. And Paul goes on, after the belt of truth, you need to put on the breastplate of righteousness. The breastplate would protect the vital organs, so that even if an arrow from the enemy was able to sneak through the lines, our hearts, our vital organs would still be protected. And so Paul teaches us that when we place our faith in and follow Jesus' teachings, that Jesus takes our sin away and gives us Jesus' righteousness, his perfection. So if an arrow sneaks through, instead of piercing our heart, it skips off our armor. That is the metaphor. So someone could say, you are nothing but a liar, you're nothing but a cheat, you're nothing but a porn addict. And instead we could say, I was, but Jesus is helping me get that part of my life back together. Your past does not define you. Instead, Jesus does. That's the idea there. So Paul says you got to have your boots on. And the idea is this is ready to take a stand and actively tell the story of Jesus where it needs to be told, what Jesus has done for you in your life. Now, this is really the fifth time in these short verses where Paul is talking and tells us to take a stand. He tells us once in verse 11, twice in verse 13, once in verse 14, and now here again in verse 15. The idea is it's active, right? Like you got to be ready. This is a fight. You got to go. And he says, take up the shield of faith. And the idea is actively trusting in God and his promises. I think really this part of the armor is really a way of summing up the other pieces of armor. And notice what it says about the shield of faith, that you use it to extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. We're not meant in battle, we're not meant to do some fancy footwork to avoid the arrows that are shot at us. We are meant to hide behind these promises of God. which means when Satan hurls things at you, ideas like, you're pathetic, remember what you did? You can remember a promise from God where he says in the Bible, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. When Satan tries to hurl something at you, what a waste of time you are. You can remember God's promise in the Bible where it says, you are my handiwork, created for a purpose. Don't let Satan steal that from you. Because you hide behind promises of God. But we have to know the promises of God in order to be able, and that's why it's so important to be here on Sunday morning. That's why it's so important to go to a Mo group, groups of people that meet in homes throughout the week to talk about the Bible. That's why it's so important for you to read or listen to your Bible, which is what Paul goes to talk on next about. He says, put on the helmet of salvation. The helmet was the last thing that a soldier would put on before going out to battle, and he uses this to remind us that there is hope, that we are given salvation through Jesus, and we can face whatever it is that comes our way because we are fully protected. He says, and take the sword of the Spirit, which is our Bibles. We have got to spend more time getting to know how to use that as a tool. Bottom line is, armor helps you win the battle. Armor is what helps you win whatever battle it is that you are facing. And then the last thing is, in most Bibles, verse 18 is separated from the other verses, like starts a new paragraph. In a lot of Bibles, not every Bible, but in a lot of Bibles it does. But I think it's a mistake. I think verse 18 actually is what completes the armor section of the Bible. And Paul says this, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. And the next slide says, with this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. I think our best weapon against a battle that's going on around us is one that we take too lightly. The prayer is really where we put into practice what we believe about everything that Jesus teaches. There's a preacher in Florida. His name's Joby Martin. And before he became a church planter, before he started a church in Florida, he actually was a bodybuilder. He was a pretty successful bodybuilder, too. Competed in competitions and things like that. And he said this recently about his time as a bodybuilder. He said, I would go to the gym and I would work out all of the time, but I never used my muscle for anything other than flexing. And then he goes on to say this. He says, too often, I think we are like that. We strengthen ourselves by coming to church, learning about the Bible. Sometimes we even read it on our own, but never do anything with the muscle. Just show up with church and flex that we know it. Says it's time to start exercising that belief in bold and frequent prayer. My challenge for you this week is to go home and with someone that you know and love and trust, to be honest with them about a place where you feel like you are under spiritual attack, and pray out loud with them this week. Go home. It could be your spouse. It could be a friend. It could be someone who's in your Mo group, goes to church with you. Say out loud where you feel like the evil one is coming after you with lies, trying to get you to believe something God would never have you believe. And to say it out loud, and then together, out loud, pray against that. Because the reality is we are all being thrown into a spiritual battle. And the absolute worst thing that you can do when thrown into a battle is start flossing. The best thing that you can do is to find some armor and to put it on. Because the good news is Paul gives us this metaphor of armor that we need to put on, and we can use that to stand up against the enemy who wants absolutely nothing more than to take you out and rob you of the life that God meant for you to live.